Water is the elixir of life. But water allocation can be a deadly affair. In the Middle East, where temperaments mirror the soaring temperatures and prejudices flow freely, the price of water is sometimes paid in blood. After the State of Israel declared independence in 1948, its leaders put their heads together to develop a water plan that would provide desperately needed fluid for drinking and irrigation purposes. Israel came up with the National Water Carrier Project, a plan to draw water from the Kinneret Lake in its north through a technically challenging network of canals, tunnels, and pipes covering a diversity of terrain and elevations, all the way down Israel's west coast to its populated center and to its parched agricultural south. The Kinneret, also known as the Sea of Galilee, is a picturesque lake in Israel's north, ringed with beaches, meadows, and mountains. It is approximately 35 miles in circumference and 150 feet at its deepest point. It held enough water to meet the demands of Israel's expanding population for decades. However, this wonderful freshwater asset is inherently fragile. It is fed mainly by the waters of the Jordan River, which originates in the gushing springs and tributaries of mountainous Lebanon and Syria. Two rivers are especially critical to the aqua that courses down the Jordan Valley before flowing into Lake Kinneret: the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banias in Syria. Without these two rivers, the Jordan's waters would drop dramatically. The Kinneret's water level would also drop, and its remaining fresh water would be irreversibly salinized by the salt springs sitting on its bed. While Israel simply wanted to have a drink, their plan drew the ire of her neighbors. Having failed to eradicate Israel in the 1948 War of Independence, the Arab world swore to at least limit her growth and economic success. Israel's water project threatened to severely undermine that goal. When Israel began construction on the national water carrier in July of 1953, the war over water was set in motion. Hostilities emerged in 3 stages that served as stepping stones towards a full-scale Arab-Israeli conflict. As Israel's tractors bit into soil north of the Kinneret, Syrian artillery units roared into action, bombarding the Israeli construction site. Syria demanded that the United Nations intervene against Israel. The Security Council wished to uphold Israel's right to resume work on its water project, but the Soviets vetoed the resolution. Israel modified its plan, moved its construction site further from Syria's border, and its engineers went back to work. But the dispute was just warming up. Syria and Jordan then colluded to divert the Yarmouk River. The Yarmouk would be forced to flow away from Israel and instead supplement the Jordanians' irrigation needs. United States President Eisenhower dispatched Ambassador Eric Johnston to resolve the situation. The result was the 1955 Johnston Plan, a brave attempt at coexistence and water sharing that Israel embraced and that the Arab League unofficially resolved to abide by, at least temporarily. The waves of war were thereby stilled for most of a decade. In 1964, Israel completed the national water carrier. It was 81 miles in length and had taken years to build at the cost of hundreds of millions of Israeli lira. But it was worth every lira. The carrier was capable of funneling an astonishing 19 million gallons of water per hour, an achievement far too great for Israel's Arab neighbors to swallow. The Arab League hastily convened in Cairo. Desperate to wreck Israel's water resource, they devised a reckless plan. The Headwater Diversion Plan called for the reduction of the water carrier's capacity by 35% by diverting its headwaters, both the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banias in Syria, into the Yarmouk River, deep in Jordanian territory. At the same time, the Arab League clarified that this was not simply a war about liquid, but rather liquidation. Since the existence of Israel is a danger that threatens the Arab nation, the diversion of the Jordan waters by it multiplies the dangers to Arab existence. Accordingly, the Arab states have to prepare so that if necessary, results are not achieved. Collective Arab military preparations will constitute the ultimate practical means for the final liquidation of Israel. Israel warned that the headwater diversion plan would infringe on its sovereign rights. In other words, it would be considered an act of war. The Arabs, however, were not opposed to a war. They launched their project, and the skirmishes began. In 1965, there were 3 high-profile border clashes. The Syrian military attacked Israeli farmers and army patrols, and Israel responded by sending tanks and artillery to destroy the Arab heavy earth-moving machines that were working on the diversion plan. The Arab states eventually abandoned their project, but the war over water inspired them to plot a war of extermination against Israel. Hostilities between Israel and Syria spiraled over the next 2 years, with Syria using the Golan Heights to rain artillery upon unprotected Israeli farms and villages in the plains below. In the first quarter of 1967, there were over 270 border incidents of sabotage and attack directed against Israel. A view of the war to come came on April 7th, when Syria fired at Israeli farmers. Israel responded with artillery, and the fight escalated. Israel sent planes against Syrian positions and villages, and in an ensuing aerial dogfight, Israel downed 6 Syrian fighter jets and chased the remainder all the way back to Damascus. Ariel Sharon later observed, "People generally regard June 5, 1967, as the day the Six-Day War began. That is the official date. But in reality, it started 2.5 years earlier, on the day Israel decided to act against the diversion of the Jordan River. In fact, it could be argued that the war began as soon as a parched Israel politely asked the Kinneret for a drink."
It's very, very interesting. And the reality is that when it comes to water supply, Israel is not quite self-sufficient. Israel has always had to rely on rainfall in order to survive. And that means that we've always been susceptible to droughts. Susceptible, right? Susceptible. Okay. Susceptible to regular droughts, which has always been a part of Jewish history from the time that Abraham comes to Israel. Right? The very first time that Abraham is commanded by God to leave and go to his land that I will show you, he comes to Israel, and what happens? There's a drought. And he's forced to leave the land and go down to Egypt, where his wife is kidnapped by Pharaoh, etc., because of the drought that was there. There was a drought in the time of Yaakov and his sons, and in the prophets we find droughts. In the Talmud there's pages and pages, chapters dealing with the laws of fasting that was made by the community in order to pray to God to end the drought. The truth is, when the Jews came to Israel and they saw this drought and this problems with the rain, this did not take them by surprise, because when they crossed the Jordan River, they were actually forewarned by Moshe that they would find this reality on the ground. Text number 1. Vivi, you want to go?
Sure.
Page 220.
By the way, I read this one, and I have a problem with one of the words here. I'll tell you
Okay.
why. The land into which you are entering to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have left. There you planted your seed and watered your fields by bringing water from the Nile by foot, like a vegetable garden. But the land that you are crossing the Jordan River to possess is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. Now, if you read the Hebrew, it's not possess, it's inherit.
That's true.
It's a
Yeah.
lot different.
Yeah, it's not the only translation I didn't like. That's, yeah. Okay, basically,
God did say we would inherit.
that's correct. The ancient Egyptians created an intricate network of canals in order to irrigate their land from the Nile River, and therefore Egypt had this constant supply of water irrigating their fields, and therefore Egypt was the paradigm of economic security and economic strength. On the other hand, Israel, that did not have these canals, did not have any kind of security, when it came to their rain, which was the basis of their economic security, was a land flowing with milk and honey, but not flowing with water, you know. And Israel never had that security when it came to the economic security. So the question we are going to ask, Ipsis, is why does God not give Israel a land, or give the Jews a land that is self-sufficient? You would think that the land of milk and honey would be a perfect land, yes.
I think so that the Jews could feel in a really tangible way how very dependent they were on God and how they needed to fulfill the mitzvot in the Holy Land so as to have that relationship.
Okay, very good, very good. Yeah?
Turns out it is.
With oil.
Self-sufficient with natural gas and desalinized water. It's just been a total miracle turnaround in the last 10 years.
Yeah, 10 years, but yes, absolutely, absolutely. But even with oil, you still need water, right? You can have oil, it doesn't help you if you don't have rain. The Jews need rain even more than they need oil. So the question is, why does God not give the Jewish people a land that's self-sufficient, that can have its own water supply? They won't have to be dependent on getting water through Arab land, and they can be independent.
Through all this interaction that we've been reading on Yetziat Mitzrayim, and the idea is that God wanted us to be trusting Him.
Yeah.
Depending on Him, but making the work ourselves, and that He would step in and help us.
Okay, we're going to get back to this question at the end of the class. Now let's get to the bulk of tonight's discussion, which is going to be about the efforts to find even one positive word about Israel in the world. As hard as it is to find rain in Israel, in a dry desert land, it's even harder to find any positive perspective and positive words about Israel, like a dry, barren desert. Now, that doesn't mean that any time that someone criticizes Israel, the criticism is illegitimate. There's a clear difference between a legitimate criticism of a nation and a land that you hold dear, and a criticism or a dislike that's just reflecting an inherent bias that is the root of hating everything that these people will do. In order for a criticism to be fair and objective, it has to be equal on the consistent standard, right?
Yes.
That's what objective means. Objective means that you're following facts, not that you're trying to reconcile the facts on the ground with your prescripted narrative. They say the joke of this police officer who sees a non-Jew that was driving and hit a Jew really hard in the rear. And so the officer comes to the guy and says to him, "Tell me, how fast was that Jew backing up when he hit you?" That's putting facts into your prescripted narrative. So if you believe in, let's say, human rights or whatever it is, right? We'll talk about the UN in a second. A fair and objective critique of human rights would be that wherever, if you care about human rights, or wherever you see a human rights violations happening, irrespective of if it's happening in Saudi Arabia or if it's happening in China, but if you see it happening and you care about human rights, you protest it and you argue against it, you fight against it. If you only care about human rights in one place in Israel and you don't care about anywhere else, it's not fair. And if your objective, your standby of human rights is in one country they don't let women drive and they'll kill a woman for honor killings, etc. But here they let women be in the Air Force and they let women be part of the government, they let women do everything, and you found something that you made up into a whole crisis, that's not an objective reality of facts. So let's get to the second video of today, which
on the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians.
The regime has also authorized the extrajudicial killings of thousands of detainees. We now believe that the Syrian regime has installed a crematorium in the Sednaya prison complex, which could dispose of detainees' remains with little evidence.
Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2012 through 2015, the Assembly adopted 97 resolutions criticizing various countries. 83 of these targeted Israel. That's 86% of all country-specific resolutions. A closer look at the Assembly's score sheet reveals that year after year, less than a quarter of its measures censure countries other than Israel. And while 3/4 of this global forum's ridden rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 15 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism, the Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who was neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to 2013, Israel was condemned in no less than 45 Human Rights Council resolutions. That is almost half, 45.9%, of all country-specific resolutions passed by the Council. This same obsession with censoring Israel is found in all branches of the United Nations. At the UN's World Health Organization Annual Assembly in Geneva in 2005, the body passed but a single resolution against a specific country. That's right, Israel. Israel was charged with violating Palestinian health rights. Similarly, at the International Labor Organization's annual conference in Geneva in 2005, the organization carried only one major country-specific report on its annual agenda. No prizes for guessing its identity. A lengthy document charged Israel with violating the rights of Palestinian workers. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There are some bias against the Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
One of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, no? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not the. There's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
See all those statistics, you see that it's crazy. Abi Iban, who was the Israeli ambassador to the UN in the Six Day War here. If Algeria were to make a resolution declaring that the earth was flat and that Israel had been the one to flatten it, it would pass by a vote of 164 to 13 with 26 absent votes. It's
Tragedy.
It's a tragedy. So there's actually a great text that brings this out very idea. I would actually recommend reading the entire text, the entire article from Mati Friedman in the Talmud magazine. He was a reporter in Gaza during the last summer operation, and the entire full article is in the additional readings, but let's read part of it tonight. Mark, you want to read? Text 2A, page 222.
Is there anything left to say about Israel and Gaza? Newspapers this summer have been full of little else. Television viewers see heaps of rubble and plumes of smoke in their sleep. A representative article from a recent issue of The New Yorker described the summer's events by dedicating one sentence each to the horrors in Nicaragua and Ukraine, 4 sentences to the crazed genocidaires of ISIS, and the rest of the article, 30 sentences to Israel and Gaza. Israeli actions are analyzed and criticized. and every flaw in Israeli society is aggressively reported. In one 7-week period, from November 8th to December 16th, 2011, I decided to count the stories coming out of our bureau on the various moral failings of Israeli society. I counted 27 separate articles, an average of a story every 2 days. In a very conservative estimate, the 7-week tally was higher than the total number of significantly critical stories about Palestinian government and society, including the totalitarian Islamists of Hamas, that our bureau had published in the previous 3 years.
3 years.
The Hamas Charter, for example, calls not just for Israel's destruction, but for the murder of Jews, and blames Jews for engineering the French and Russian revolutions and both world wars. The Charter was never mentioned in print when I was at the AP, though. Hamas won a Palestinian national election and had become one of the region's most important players. To draw the link with this summer's events, an observer might think Hamas's decision in recent years to construct a military infrastructure beneath Gaza's civilian infrastructure would be deemed newsworthy, if only because what it meant about the way the next conflict would be fought and the cost to innocent people. But that is not the case. The Hamas emplacements were not important in themselves and were therefore ignored. What was important was the Israeli decision to attack them. There has been much discussion recently of Hamas attempts to intimidate reporters. Any veteran of the press corps here knows the intimidation is real, and I saw it in action myself as an editor on the AP news desk. During the 2008-2009 Gaza fighting, I personally erased a key detail, that Hamas fighters were dressed as civilians and being counted as civilians in the death toll because of a threat to our reporter in Gaza. The policy was then and remains not to inform readers that the story is censored unless the censorship is Israeli. Earlier this month, the AP's Jerusalem news editor reported and submitted a story on Hamas intimidation. The story was shunted into deep freeze by his superiors and has not been published.
Right. Okay, that's what we call not exactly fairness, right? I'll give you one example. How many people here can tell me how many innocent civilians were killed by American airstrikes in Iraq or in Mosul trying to reclaim it from the terrorists? No one knows. Not that none have died. I don't know the number offhand. It's not reported. There's been many, many attacks. There was just recently a building that they wired the entire building with explosives. They deliberately sent the missile from there, and they killed, I don't know how many people were inside that building. Over 100, a few hundred people that were in that building. Innocent civilians that were deliberately placed there, and America killed them. It's the collateral damage of war. I'm not coming to criticize or to condone. But no one talked. The point is that the media barely even mentioned it. It's not even a story that gets any kind of publicity or hype. Definitely not. You ask me, an average American, how many people have we killed in ISIS, in the fight against ISIS? No one even knows it happened. It's not even an issue. Whereas when Israel is fighting in Gaza, defensive war against a terrorist organization that deliberately entrenches themselves within the schools, within the civilian population, every single particular story gets played over and over and over and over. Yeah.
What about the tunnels that they built underneath? They captured the Shabbat.
Yeah. So that's why at least now, thank God, Israel is very aggressively pushing in the media the fact that they discovered now a tunnel going under 2 UN schools. They're making a big deal out of it. Thank God.
There was a lady that kept complaining she hears voices. This is a true story. And they thought she was not.
We can't hear you over here.
They started to medicate her. They thought she was crazy.
There was a lady that was claiming that she was hearing voices under her bedroom, under her bed.
Yeah. They thought she was crazy. In the end, they discovered that she was hearing them talking in the tunnel that they had built under her home.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a real problem. It's a real problem. Okay. That's as far as, yeah.
So the media report on the Middle East wars, you connecting that with the UN resolutions, or is that a different phenomenon?
Are they connected? Yeah. That's a very good question. And what we're going to say today is that at their core, they're very much connected. Even though there are different manifestations and different expressions of what we're going to explain is really anti-Semitism, at their core, it's the same thing. The core, a different manifestation. It expresses itself in different ways. BDS is another expression of the same core issue. It's a very different manifestation of it, very different format, but in its core, it's the same. We're gonna be addressing.
You're saying the American media is not anti-Semitic?
Yes.
I
think I'm going to answer the question.
Who's anti? I didn't hear what he said.
The media. It's not, by the way, it's not necessarily American media. The problem is there's a bunch of groupthink when it comes to media and international stories. All the media of the world are operating out of the same building. They're all eating together, going to the same bars, sharing stories, they're all copying from each other. You have one or two main news outlets, the AP, etc. And most media today is just the same thing being repeated over and over on different websites, all the same thing. Not the good old days where every single legitimate news organization had their own people. So it's not like it's American media per se. It's the media in general, which is very much a world narrative.
How many of these media is Jewish?
Tons of them. And so that's a very sad part about it. The BDS and all that, and all the heads of BDS are all Jews, little faggots.
The report that condemned Israel and Gaza.
Goldstone, yeah. Jews are talented at being our worst enemies.
Yeah, exactly.
That's another conversation.
Yeah.
You can thank one. There's one particular party you can thank. I'm just saying.
The one to do what?
I'm just saying there's one particular party we have in this country. You can thank them.
It's not. No, it's not. No, I'm going to strongly disagree with you. It's not one political party that causes these issues. The issues have existed. We'll talk. We will address that. We'll address that everything. They've existed long ago. They will exist long after any one particular. Okay. Text 2b. Let's go. Irma, you want to read text 2b? This is about the objectivity of the media.
Israel's story is framed in the same terms that have been used since early 1990s. The quest for a two-state solution. It is accepted that the conflict is Israeli-Palestinian, meaning that it's a conflict taking place on land that Israel controls. 0.2% of the Arab world, in which Jews are a majority and Arabs a minority. The conflict is more accurately described as Israeli-Arab or Jewish-Arab. That is, a conflict between 6 million Jews of Israel and 300 million Arabs in surrounding countries. Perhaps the Israeli Muslim would be more accurate. To take into account the country of non-Arab states like Iran and Turkey, and more broadly, 1 billion Muslims worldwide. This is the conflict that's been playing out in different forms for a century before Israel existed, before Israel captured the Palestinian territories of Gaza and the West Bank, and before the term Palestinian was in use. The Israeli-Palestinian framing allows the Jews, a tiny minority in the Middle East, to be depicted as the stronger party. It also includes the implicit assumption that if the Palestinian problem is somehow solved, the conflict will be over. So no informed person today believes this to be true.
Right. That's a very good point. Which means that it's not an issue about Palestinians per se. There's millions upon billions of Arabs in many countries that are completely dedicated to the concept of eradicating Israel off the face of the map. So just in quick summary, fair news coverage, which would not only mention civilian deaths, it would mention the terrorists that are dressing and hiding as civilians. It would not only mention Israel attacking Gaza, it would describe the infrastructure, the military infrastructure being built in Gaza that caused the war to happen. It wouldn't just talk about Israeli censorship of the news, it would talk about the Hamas intimidation and censorship of the news. That's as far as fair. As far as objective, we have to stop allowing the world to create this narrative as an Israeli-Palestinian problem. This issue existed before 1948. It's really existed for several thousand years. But in this context, in this manifestation, it's existed as an Israeli-Arab conflict before there was a state called Israel. It's existed before 1967, before there were settlements. And if there would be no more settlements left, and we give away all the land we captured in 1967, there would still be a billion Arabs waiting for the day that Israel would be destroyed. And then you have, going back to the media, you have the wording that you use. When you talk about, again, if you read that entire lengthy article and the additional readings after the class, one of the issues is the language that's used from a bias that creates a certain mindset. The words you use are very important. When you look at these headlines, like 3 Palestinians killed as daily violence grinds on, doesn't describe the fact that the Palestinians killed were actually terrorists carrying knives trying to stab people. Somehow they're not terrorists anymore. They're just innocent Palestinians who were killed killed in the daily violence that they were actually the ones that were perpetrating. But, yeah.
There was a lot of anger over the fact that they kept saying that we're blowing up the women and children. But they forgot to mention that they stored all their weapons in the bed, in the homes of the women.
So that's not fair coverage. But then when you have clear, obvious bias, when you have a headline, like this headline, that says another alleged Palestinian stabber shot by Israeli cops, right, September 19th. And then you see, the man that they shot was actually stabbing people. But that's completely missing from the headline. Completely missing. That's an open, that's not just unfair or unobjective. That's open bias directly against the Jewish people. It's like the joke of this Israeli guy who's walking the streets of Paris. He sees a pit bull that breaks loose and he starts attacking. The pit bull attacks this young girl. He's a brave man. He jumps onto the pit bull. He grabs and starts wrestling with the dog. Eventually he manages to kill the dog and save the child. And the news reporter there says to this Israeli, says, "Tell me who you are, tell me your name. Tomorrow the front page story of the newspaper will be brave Frenchman saves girl from crazy bulldog, pit bull." So he says, "Actually, I'm not a Frenchman. I'm not from Paris." So okay, so right, hero saves girl from crazy dog. Says, "I'm from Israel." Next morning, the headlines of the paper said, "Israeli man kills dog." Okay. So, obviously, the saying focus over here, when you see these pictures of these headlines that are so openly anti-biased against Israel, the question we can't help but ask is, why, right? And so in order to understand that, we need to go back and explore the old problem of anti-Semitism in general, and along with that comes the Jewish question Jews have been asking for thousands of years: why do they hate us, right? What have we done to make them hate us? Because we assume it must be our fault. So, first of all, just to bring across the idea that, especially for you, Mordechai, this is not a recent problem. It's not a problem that's because of any one politician or any one political party or even...
It's been going back since...
You look at the next page, you look on your student books. Yeah, you see anti-Semitism that happened throughout history in many different cultures, in many different societies, in places where Jews were rich, in places where Jews were poor, in all different areas of the world. And as the Torah tells us, we say this in Haggadah every single year on Pesach, and when we lift up the cups of wine at the beginning of the story, we say V'hisha Amda, text number 3, Susan, page 230.
It is not one individual alone who has risen against us to destroy us, but in every generation they rise against us to destroy us.
Right, Paro was only the first anti-Semite that wanted to destroy the Jewish people, but he was not even close to coming last. They've literally been in every generation in one form or another. Some have been more intense than others, like anything in life that has its highs and its lows, but there's always been some form of anti-Semitism, to the extent that it's really that in Japan, which has very, very few Jews living in Japan, very few Jews live in Japan, there has been documented anti-Semitism happening in Japan. Now, logically, it makes no sense that a Japanese person who's never seen a Jew in his life should be an anti-Semitic person. There's no logical connection, and yet it happens. By raise of hands, who here in this room has directly been affected by anti-Semitism? Who's heard someone calling them dirty Jew or whatever? Never?
Very fortunate.
Every day for 7 years,
Okay.
used to go to a Hebrew school every day from public school through a Polish neighborhood. Let me tell you something. You've never heard anything like this or seen anything like this in your life. I mean, every day. But you know what? We live. I'm here.
So basically, almost every single person in this room raised their hands because it is still very much real. And even living in America, it's a little bit more shrouded, and we'll discuss it soon how it manifests in itself in America. But it's still very much real. So the question is, let's have a discussion for a minute or two. Why, in your opinion, are the Jews targeted for so much persecution? Yes.
I think jealousy and fear.
Jealousy and fear, okay. Yeah, sorry?
I think the basis of anti-Semitism was the rise of the Catholic Church.
Okay, Catholic Church.
But it was way before then, I think.
Yeah.
Way before that.
Yeah.
Maybe the modern day anti-Semitism.
I think it's connected to the fact that we were given the Torah
But I
and
agree.
the commandments, and that we were assigned a mission in the world, and the world is not like a conscience.
Okay.
And wants to kill the conscience.
Okay, yeah, Mark.
Jews have never submitted to governments. They're always part of, but it's always very frustrating that they never submit to what is happening around them.
We've held ourselves different.
Yes, we hold ourselves
Which
different.
is exactly what we were saying, that we have a view of ourselves.
Chosen.
We view ourselves as chosen people. Yeah. Okay, Stuart and
I think
Myron.
it's said in the book of Exodus, right from the very start of the book of Exodus, it says the Jews rose, large people multiplied throughout the land. They were rich. They were afraid that they would be taking over the country, and I think this is the thing.
Economic fear.
There's a book out about called the Beast in the Forest, I believe, about the first American ambassador to Nazi Germany, he was finally kicked out by the Nazis for being anti-Nazi. He had a conversation with the German foreign minister about some of this stuff, and the German foreign minister says, well, don't you have, we have a Jewish problem. They own the newspapers and the banks and the television. Don't you have a Jewish problem? The American ambassador says, yes, we have the same Jewish problem. And this is, it's the success and the fear of success.
It's economic fear, okay, yes.
We're clannish, we take care of our own. And the interesting thing is, throughout history, the Jews were invited into a country, they prospered in the country, their wealth was taken and kicked out. I mean, but this went on.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. In many different places, yeah. In the back of the room, yeah, Steve.
Jews have always remained separate and independent.
Okay. Clannish, that's what he was saying. We stick up for our own. We view a certain allegiance to our own.
Yeah, but so do many other peoples too, but yet they're not hated.
That's true also.
By the Jews. So many people do that,
Well, any other thoughts before we go? Yeah.
I would agree, with the theology, that because you can't have two theologies that are the truth. So if Judaism is truth, then they don't have truth. So they have to discredit us and our theology and hate us because, they have to believe in what they believe is true. And as long as we're around, we're the example that proves that they're not true.
Okay, so I wish I would have had actually a whiteboard here and written down all these ideas you're saying, because in truth, everything that was said here can go into one of three core reasons why typically people blame the rise of anti-Semitism. The first is, as was mentioned, theology, right? Whether the Christian church, whether it's Islam today, there is a strong theological underpinning to many of the anti-Semitic attacks and incidents that happened throughout history. For whichever theology you believe in, whether it was Christianity then, or the Crusaders, the Spanish Inquisition, etc. A second core issue is that many people feel that we cause anti-Semitism by viewing ourselves as chosen, as you were saying. We view ourselves as having a divine mission in the world. We view ourselves as being different, being better, being unique from everyone else. And therefore we bring the anti-Semitism upon ourselves. And the third reason, which is also mentioned, Stuart, about economic reasons. People are afraid of the success. They're jealous of the success of the Jews. They are envious. They're convinced that we own everything. The famous joke I said many times of this Jew who's sitting in the 50s on the train. He's reading like this anti-Semitic Nazi newspaper. So the other Jew sees him and says, Moshe, what are you reading this anti-Semitic garbage for? He says, what should I do? When I read the Yiddish newspaper, all I see is tsaras. This guy was killed and this guy is broken. It's only bad news. I open the anti-Semitic Nazi newspaper, it's great. The Jews on the media, and the Jews on the bank, and the Jews on the theaters. I feel like $1 million, yeah. Right? So they're convinced that we've stolen all their money and we've stolen all their wealth, and therefore we're the cause of all the world, global problems. Right? That's really, those three statements incorporate within them basically almost all the theories given to explain anti-Semitism. So let us go through each one of those three. Let us assess it. Let us see how much it holds up to the reality of, the test of reality. And let us try to understand the real reason for anti-Semitism. Number one. Christian and Islamic theology alone cannot explain why today there's anti-Semitism being documented in Japan. Japan is not a religious country in any way, shape, or form. In fact, one of the greatest
You had mentioned, this is several times, you mentioned Japanese anti-Semitism. Is this something that has been occurring recently?
Recently.
Yeah, because during the Second World War, though, they did have an ambassador who saved thousands of Jews and brought them into Japan from
I should say very clearly, if I didn't say before, that I in no way have implying that every single non-Jew is an anti-Semite. There have been non-Jews that have been righteous Gentiles who have literally risked their lives to save countless Jews. The Japanese ambassador's name, I know Chabad. There's Chabad rabbis that are from direct descendants of the Schindler. Obviously, you have other ones that are less famous.
Yeah.
There's many righteous Gentiles that are, and I'm not even saying that the majority of Gentiles are anti-Semites, but this what we're discussing is not the people, the cause. Yeah. Okay, so. One of the greatest anti-Semitic incidents that ever happened in the history of mankind and to affect the Jews was the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was in no way perpetrated in any kind of religious sense. Hitler, Yimach Shemai, was completely anti-religion. He was completely anti-religion. Another good proof of that is you look in the Soviet Union, the USSR, and all the suffering the Jews had in communist Russia. Communism was liberally non-religious. There was no religion allowed in communism. And the Jews suffered terribly, even after the fall of communism, you see. Let's see text number 4. Faith, you want to read text number 4?
Sure. What makes the Soviet case instructive is, in no small measure, the fact that the professed purpose of communism was to abolish all nations, peoples, and religions. Those great engines of exclusion on the road to the creation of the new world and new man. In the eyes of Stalin and his henchmen, the Jews, starting with the loyal communists among them, were always suspect. Ideological immigrants in the telling phrase. But the animosity went beyond Jewish communists. The Soviet regime declared war on over 100 nationalities and religions under its boot. Whole peoples were deported, entire classes destroyed, millions starved to death, and tens of millions killed. Everybody suffered, not only Jews, but decades later, long after Stalin's repression had given way to only one national language, Hebrew, and was banned in the Soviet Union. Only one group, the Jews, was not permitted to establish schools for its children. Only in the case of one group, the Jews did the term fifth line, referring to the space reserved for nationality on the Soviet citizens' identification papers, become a code for the license discrimination.
Okay, so we see clearly that religious theology alone is not a justification to explain a large number of the people that have been killed because of anti-Semitism, because of Jew hatred. Some of the greatest Jew haters in history have in no way been religious, from Joseph Stalin to Adolf Hitler.
I disagree with that, Rabbi, because Adolf Hitler took, you read a history of him, took a lot of his teachings and beliefs from Martin Luther, who was the Protestant reformer, who was beyond an. I mean, he made Hitler look like like a rabbi, mean, this guy was so anti-Semitic. He didn't start out that way. He started as a friend to the Jews, and he said he was against the Catholic Church, back then. And then once he got, the Protestant religion off his ground, he called all the Jewish leaders into Germany and said, listen, now we did all this great stuff for you, except the Eshki. And they said, no way. And then the most virulent so Hitler based a lot of his teachings and his beliefs.
But without any of the religious part, there was no Jesus involved. There was no Christianity involved.
I don't know.
Meaning, even if you're correct, and I think you are, about the history that he came from Martin Luther, his hatred to the Jews was for religious reasons.
Right.
But Hitler had no allegiance to Jesus. He was in no way pro-Christian.
At first he did, but then later on, as he became totally crazy, he started in his own mind, he was God. You know what I mean? So, but during the time of, from like 1937, 1938, he was a very, if you read his speeches in the beer gardens, he used Christianity as a huge tool for Jewish anti-Semitic.
But my point is that he kept the anti-Semitism part without the religious cause of it. He just was anti-Semite, independent of the religion. And forget about Hitler. All the other Germans.
Yeah.
Forget them. What about the Czechoslovakians and the Poles?
Well,
Poles were very religious. But Czechoslovakians, are they religious people?
Yeah. They're Greek and Russian Orthodox. Yeah.
But their hatred for the Jews wasn't because of their church per se.
What about the Hungarians?
What, are they religious? Are they very Christian?
Yeah, can't be sure.
And they hated it. It wasn't
the
origin. It was just it provided a very fertile ground for him to plant the seeds of racial anti-Semitism in Europe.
What about Joseph Stalin? He wasn't religious.
A theological upbringing. His education was theological.
Everyone in the world had a theological upbringing.
Right,
but the point is that wasn't the cause of his hatred.
Anti-Semitism is super rational. You cannot source it back in a rational way.
That's exactly what I'm going to be getting to tonight. That's exactly what I wanted to say. There's no rational explanation for anti-Semitism. It is super rational. It defies any form of logical explanation. That is exactly what we're going to try and say. Let's go to the next usual argument given for anti-Semitism, that it's our fault because we view ourselves as a chosen people. We view ourselves as different, right? One of the most famous anti-Semites, Haman, made that very argument. You know the story of Haman, right? He comes to the king, he says, 10,000, yeah, exactly. He says, let's, where's the Hamantashen, right? Chaim. And Haman says to Achashverosh, what does he say to Achashverosh? Steve, want to read?
Sure. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered among and separate from the peoples throughout all the provinces of the kingdom. Their law differs from those of every people, and they do not keep the king's law. It is therefore of no use for the king to let them be. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed to destroy them.
Okay? So, in many of the instances of persecution, the Jews were not overtly different than their neighbors. In fact, again, let's look at two of the most famous times of anti-Semitism and persecution for the Jews. One is the Holocaust, and where the Holocaust began in Germany, the Jews were very, very much integrated and assimilated within German society. They were as enlightened in the arts and in the theater, etc. They were not, as a whole, a distinct people that stuck out as a sore thumb. The second most famous and difficult times for Jewish people was the Spanish Inquisition. And the Spanish Inquisition, although it was rooted in the church and there was a theological hatred of the Jewish people at that time were also very, very much integrated parts of Spanish society. Very, very much so. So we can't say that's the reason why there's anti-Semitism.
The Inquisition, in some of the readings that I did, was really against Jews who professed to be Christian but were secret Jews. Kept their Judaism.
Well, eventually the conversos, or the Moranos as they were derogatorily called, that's because the other Jews that were openly Jewish were forced to leave the country. So the only way that they could express their anti-Semitism was on these Jews that had stayed and hidden their Judaism.
One of the, at least I thought I read, one of the rabbis, the old rabbis, said basically, when in Rome, do as the Romans. In other words, follow man's law when you're in a country that is not your own country.
Okay.
Follow man's law. But of course, religion is separate from man's law.
There is a concept you have to follow civil law. I mean, you have to follow traffic laws, etc., or legal contracts.
Yeah.
But I'm not. Let's not get to this off subject. The third issue that is given why people hate the Jews is because of economical reasons, which was really the main issue that Hitler had against the Jews. I mean, also there's race issues, but his real issue that riled up the German people was nothing to do with race or with even though Martin Luther King. His real thing that riled them up was that it's the Jews, they stabbed us in the back after World War I. He had no proof for it, but after World War I, they're the ones that caused us to be not have an army, etc. They destroyed our economy. That was really the root of the German anti-Semitism, if you were to say there was a root. And yet, what's amazing, and that's what you did, like talking about plays and theater, right? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, etc. Were the money hungry because we weren't allowed to own land. We weren't allowed to do a lot of other professions, so we became the money lenders. And yet, for every communist who hated the Jews for being the wealthy capitalist oppressors, there was a capitalist, there was a socialist who accused the Jews of being communist, right? Whatever it is. So the best idea is that let's read text number 6. You want to read text number 6, Stuart? This is from Menachem Zemba, who writes it beautifully, who himself was destined to become a victim of anti-Semitism. Text number 6.
Many seek to uncover the root cause and justifications for anti-Semitism. History has demonstrated, however, that not a single cause is correct. Hatred defies cause or reason. Here they hate the Jews because they are capitalists. There they hate them because they are socialists. Here they hate the Jews because they are industrious and shrewd. There they hate them because they are a burden on society and provide no benefit to the citizenry. Here they hate the Jew because they are excessively religious and zealous. Here they hate them because they are liberal, enlightened, and promulgate secular views. The reasons are always contradictory.
Exactly. And this is the point that I want to make, is that there is absolutely no change of lifestyle, no change of clothing, no change of conduct, no change of faith that will solve anti-Semitism, because at its core, anti-Semitism is, as you said correctly, it's a super-rational existence. There is nothing in particular we do to cause it, and therefore there is nothing we can do in our control to prevent it. It is a simple fact of the universe, the same way God made trees, and God made rivers, and God made monkeys, and God made elephants. God made anti-Semitism as a reality of the universe. Yes?
I'd like to give a personal experience. I taught in New York City, and I taught in all Afro-American schools. And these were high school kids, and they always used to say to me, Mr. Gold, why is it that the Jews own everything? Now I'm talking about Queens. I'm not talking about an area in Park Avenue. I'm talking about Queens, New York. And they always explain, every place we go on Jamaica Avenue, every store is owned by the Jews. What do you have that you are so successful while the blacks can't get the first place? This is from kids who were high school kids.
Right.
And you can't get rid of that notion.
And yet that argument, if you know our history and know that we came to America from DP camps, from the destroy, where most of those people that had those stores on Jamaica Avenue had their parents that had stores in some shtetl in Poland or in Hungary that had been destroyed, that had been looted, that had been burned to the ground on Kristallnacht and taken and confiscated. So it's not a logical argument to say that. It's not a logical argument. But the point is that if anti-Jewish hatred or anti-Semitism is not something that we caused, nor is it something that we can fix, is the same true of anti-Israel sentiment. Meaning, is the hatred that the world feels toward Israel today the same thing as a hatred the world felt towards the Jews during the Holocaust? Or is it just merely a new face of the same issue? And what we're going to argue is that it absolutely is the exact same thing in a different mutation. Another excellent article, the full articles and additional readings from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, text number 7. Mordechai, want to read text number 7?
Anti-Semitism is not an ideology. The Kohen said, I believe it's an endless stream of contradictions. The best way to understand it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense the human immune system. How do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in doing so defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. In the first century is the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages this was religion. This is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion has lost privilege, and the supreme authority is now science. Radical anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, and the idea that society as a weak and strong survived by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. By the late 20th century, science...
Meaning, let me say, the study of race, when Hitler hates the Jews because they're not the Aryan race, nothing religious about that.
Right.
It was some kind of made-up science so that maybe made sense then.
They looked at the Jews as weak, and the Aryan race as strong.
A scientific thing, yeah.
Right? By the late 20th century, science has lost its privilege, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the Supreme Court source of legitimacy is human rights. This is why Jews or the Jewish state are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity.
He's making an excellent point, which is that no one's going to get up there and say, I hate Jews. It's just not politically correct to say that. No one's going to get up there and say, I hate Jewish people. That's an irrational statement. So instead they hide behind politically correct cliches and politically correct statements that are fitting in the current... So if you were living in the times of Hitler, to say, I believe in the superior race because that's what science has decided, so you're hiding your hatred for Jews, you're hiding your anti-Semitism in a cloak of scientific advancement, of etc. And today, the hatred for Israel, no one says, I hate Jews. They hide it behind this noble, righteous fight for human rights, for dignity, for the oppressed Palestinian people. Yeah. That's the holy, righteous cloak in which they hide their hatred. And the whole BDS movement is, again, it's all hidden in this cloak of righteousness, that I'm fighting for human rights, I'm fighting against attempted genocide. In the meantime, there's real genocide happening in 30 different countries in the world. You go to Darfur, you go to Syria, you go to these places where there's literally, as we speak, you go to Rwanda, you go to where was all the those girls that were kidnapped from Boko Haram and all that, right, to Nigeria. People are dying in Nigeria like crazy. You go to Nigeria, you have to think in the back of your mind, what country is that? No one's talking about it, right? If you read the news, you know once a month, you read an article once a month that something happened. No one's talking about it. If they really cared about human rights, there'll be fights. There'll be things going on all over the world demanding for people in Nigeria, for Darfur, and for Syria. Syrian civil war is happening. I don't know what the number is now. How many people have been killed? 500,000 people have died, maybe more. The world is... nothing's happening. The human rights warriors and social justice warriors are not fighting for that. There's no BDS against Syria because they don't really care about human rights. It's anti-Semitism, cloaked in what's the politically correct jargon of today. A proof that anti-Israel sentiment is really anti-Semitism is in the fact that around the world, you have Jews that are not Israeli, that have no connection to Israel, have never been to Israel, that are targets of anti-Semitic attacks in the name of defending the Palestinians or because of Israeli policies. One example of this, Conley, want to read text number 8?
A spokesman for the regional court in the city of Germany, explained the court's decision regarding the three German Palestinians who sought to firebomb the synagogue in July of 2014. The court said in its 2015 decision that the three men wanted to draw attention to the Gaza conflict with Israel and deemed the attack not to be motivated by anti-Semitism. After the court's ruling, Volker Beck, a leading Green Party MP, said the attack on the synagogue was motivated by anti-Semitism and blasted the court for issuing a decision stating that the goal of the attack was to highlight the war in Gaza. This is a mistaken decision as far as the motives of the perpetrators are concerned. He said, adding that the burning of a synagogue in Germany because of the Middle East conflict can be attributed only to anti-Semitism. What do Jews in Germany have to do with the Middle East conflict? Every bit as much as Christians, non-religious people, or Muslims in Germany, namely absolutely nothing.
Right. If there was such a thing as honest anti-Israel sentiment, then that phenomenon would not in any way have any impact on Jews going to synagogue in Germany. I have no connection whatsoever. It's only because these Jews in Germany have nothing to do with Zionism, nothing to do with Israel. It's directly an excuse for revealing the anti-Semitism those people feel against having a synagogue in their neighborhood. Secondly, maybe even more importantly, as we already discussed, there is such a strong bias in the world against Israel. The fact that Israel is constantly singled out in the media and constantly singled out in the UN is directly not because they were fighting for human rights. Again, if the UN was really concerned about human rights, they have a lot of work to do. A lot of work that they completely, deliberately are ignoring. The real reason why the UN is so unbelievably, illogically obsessed with Israel, it's illogical that one organization should be so focused out of the whole world on such a small country, on such small issues, relatively speaking, to the much larger issues. It's not logical. And the same thing in the media. The fact that the media spends so many reported and there's so much reporting on what's going on in Israel, every other story gets boring after a while. They move on to the next topic, the next thing. You don't have the amount of, again, if you read that lengthy article, the amount of reporters that are sent to a place shows how important the editors think that story is. The fact that the media, the UN, have so much emphasis on what's going on in Israel is something completely irrational, it's completely illogical, it is, in its truth, rooted in another illogical phenomena, which is anti-Semitism. And the point that we have to understand is that the same way we realize that there's no way we can cure anti-Semitism, there's no way that we are ever going to stop anti-Semitism from happening, because we're not the cause of it. There is no way that we can do anything to remove any of these causes, so to say, causes of the anti-Israeli sentiment. It's not something that's caused by anything logical. It's not caused because of something that Israel once did, because Israel wants water, or because Israel has settlements, because Israel has an air force, because we have a nuclear bomb. That is not the cause of it. And therefore there's nothing that Israel is going to be able to do to ever cause that there should not be anti-Israel sentiment in the world. So, if that's the case, it's pretty harsh, huh? Pretty harsh what I just said. So, that's right. So where do we go? So where do we go from here? That was the most negative, depressing thing you hear me say in a long time. Right? Where do we go from here? I should say actually one more thing. Before I get to where we go from here, there's a third way of dealing with anti-Semitism. The third way of dealing with anti-Semitism is where the Jews have tried to either assimilate or they try to become autonomous. That was the other approach, right? So in Germany they tried to assimilate. That obviously didn't help. So the other solution was, we discussed last week, that one of the fundamental ideas of creating Zionism was to, if we would have an autonomous state where we're completely independent, where we're not bothering anyone, we're not in their land, not in their space, then we won't have any more problems. The world will love us. That was one of the ideas that Zionism is founded upon. We'll be autonomous, we'll be a nation like all of the nations, and the world won't bother us. And not only is it not successful, it hasn't worked for one day since Israel's become autonomous.
That all the time saying we're on their land, we took their land. So how can we be autonomous and not bother anybody? The fact that we exist bothers them.
That's correct. Exactly. And there's another thing that people try to do, which is to try and rely on the other nations to protect us. Right? Right. And the sad truth is that all too often, when we've needed assistance from other countries that could have helped us, we waited, and we waited, and we hoped in vain. When in the times of history, when the Jews were being attacked by the Crusaders, and they went to the local pirates, the local priests that had promised, that had been paid, the local noblemen that had been paid good money by the Jews to protect them, and they hid them in their castle, just so all the Jews were collected in one place, with the entire castle. We opened the moats, opened up, and the Jews killed man, woman, and child. In modern day history, some of the famous examples of this would be, in general, the American approach to dealing with the Holocaust, President Roosevelt not bombing the train tracks, the famous St. Louis right? The ship that came full of Jews from Europe, couldn't get accepted anywhere, not in America, not in Canada, not in Cuba, and was forced to go back to Europe where all those people were to die. And the same thing is with Israel. We saw in the first class of this series, in the build-up to the Six-Day War, where Israel is desperately trying to get someone in the world to do something to end the embargo on the Straits of Tehran. The world is quiet. America's not doing anything. Britain's not doing anything. The UN not doing anything. The UN ran away. The UN ran. They ran with their tail between their legs. Right? No one in the world would lift their proverbial pinky to help us. Right? I actually saw an amazing documentary this past week called Above and Beyond. Someone recommended it to me. Above and Beyond, I think maybe we'll show it to the men's club next year. Above and Beyond is about the foundation of the Israeli Air Force. In 1948, Israel had no Air Force. And they needed an Air Force, and they had no pilots, not only they had no planes. And there was tons and tons of leftover surplus, World War II surplus materials. But America put an embargo on selling any weapons, any planes, any guns to Israel. They didn't think Israel was going to make it in 1948. So not only did we not have any pilots, not only not have any planes, we couldn't buy the planes because there's an embargo. So the fascinating story, how they make up a fake Panama airline to buy planes to this Panama airline to ship the planes out of America to Panama to get them to Turkey or wherever to base. The American, there was an amazing story, but the American, Jewish American soldiers who had fought in World War II, that volunteered, a completely volunteer army, Air Force anyway. All, not all Americans, but all foreigners, Australians, foreigners that volunteered to come and fight, and these like one engine propeller planes that like barely attached from pieces that they bought in junkyards all over the world, like put together. Anyway, I mean, for us, America they wouldn't let us. They wouldn't fight for us. They wouldn't let us buy an airplane. We had to work double as hard. It's been all the extra energy and effort and money to sneak them out of America where they're sitting in junkyards.
That's why they hate us.
Yeah. So, despite all this, we continue to survive. Why? Why do we continue to survive? It's getting a little late. Text number 9. Mike, you want to read?
Jewish people at once attract my attention by the number of wonderful and singular facts which appear about them. This family or people is the most ancient within human knowledge. A fact which seems to me to inspire peculiar veneration for it. This people is not eminent solely by their antiquity, but is also singularly by their duration, which has always continued from their origin till now. Whereas the nations of Greece and of Italy, of Lacedaemon, of Athens and of Rome, and others who came long after have long since perished, these ever remain. And in spite of the endeavors of many powerful kings who have 100 times tried to destroy them, as their historians testify, and as it is easy to conjecture from the natural order of things during so long a space of years, they have nevertheless been preserved, and this preservation has been foretold.
Okay, so now where do we go from here? So what do we do with all this wonderful, uplifting information that I share with you tonight? Where do we go, Irma? What do we do? So, what's the secret of Jewish immortality? One last piece of Torah to get an answer. The Medrash tells us a story. What's the story? Text number 10. You want to read? You want to read text number 10? You have a book there? Terry, you want to read text number 10?
The Roman Empire...
Emperor, Hadrian said...
The Roman Emperor Hadrian said to Rabbi Yeshua, "Great is the sheep that survives in the midst of 70 wolves." Rabbi Yeshua responded, "Great is the shepherd who saves the sheep, protects it, and vanquishes the wolves that Yeshua has."
Right, so clearly this is a coded conversation. What is this exchange? So the emperor is referring to the 70 nations of the world, the 70 wolves, right? And the Jewish people are this little shepsele, this little sweet, innocent sheep. One lone sheep surrounded by a pack of 70 wolves. And the Roman emperor says to Rabbi Yeshua, "Wow, it's fascinating. Look at this one little sheep that survived despite 70 wolves surrounding it." Yeshua says back to the Roman emperor, There's no way in the world that a sheep can survive among 70 wolves. It's impossible. It's only because there's a shepherd that's protecting this little shepsela from the 70 wolves that are licking their chops, chomping the licks, however you call it, waiting to take a bite out of this nice little piece of lamb, right? Which means as follows. What is he really saying? That the Jewish people have survived because of the shepherd. And therefore we understand that the survival of our nation is not a natural phenomenon. It is only because of God's repeated interventions on our behalf. And therefore we have to understand a basic idea in Judaism, that God deals with us the way we deal with Him, with reciprocal fashion, which means the more that you trust in Him, the more that He fulfills our trust. The more we show God that we're not relying on other nations, we're not relying on our own sophistication, we're not relying on our army, we're relying on God to take care of us. The more we do that, the more we trust the shepherd, the better off we are going to be, because trusting the wolves will get us absolutely nowhere. There's a verse, a famous verse. Text number 11 is a verse from Bilam, the prophet. The verse we're about to read, I want to ask you if you view this verse that we're going to read as a compliment or a curse. Marsha, you want to read text number 11?
Behold, it is a people that dwells alone and is not reckoned among the nations.
So in your mind, Marsha, is that a blessing or a curse? Steve can help you. I'll let him cheat if you want. What?
I think it's good.
You say it's good. Steve is not sure.
He tried
It's both.
to curse us.
So Bilam was hired, the one that said this verse was hired to curse the Jewish people. But the way the story goes, every single time he opened his mouth, instead of curses coming out, blessings came out. Which means that this is a blessing direct from God to the Jewish people. And what is this blessing really? It's an expression of our self-sufficiency that comes from the fact that we rely on God. Because we have our shepherd, because we have God that protects us, we can be a single little sheep surrounded by 70 wolves, and we will endure, we will prevail. That's an unbelievable blessing. In fact, the opening of the verse says, it's not in the text, but for from this nation's beginning, I see them as established and powerful like mountains and hills. That's what Bilam is saying. From the beginning of time, these Jews have survived like a mountain. Why? Even though they're only one little sheep, they're small little people. Because they have a shepherd that takes care of them, that keeps them protected and separated from all the influences around them. 1 second. Now what's ironic is that you have many Jews that take this very blessing that God gave us through Bilam, and they want to see it as a curse. And they want to say that the fact that we live alone and separated from the Gentiles, it's a bad thing. They're desiring to find legitimacy in the eyes of the nations. My friends, I have to apologize that, again, the video camera something is wrong with the inside. The data filled up and the recording stopped. We had a fascinating conversation between the class, a very interactive conversation, a very good conversation about anti-Semitism. I'm sorry we don't have it, it got cut off in the middle, but because I've gotten so much feedback privately and in comments, I want to just quickly record the end of the class, the story I shared with Prime Minister Rabin, and the conclusion just to wrap it all up. So, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1972 was the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. And he was asked by President Shazar at the time, Zalman Shazar, to go and visit the Rebbe. He comes into a private audience in 1972 together with the Rebbe, late at night. And you can actually go onto Chabad.org and you can watch a video, there's recordings of Prime Minister Rabin actually describing in first-hand detail exactly the interaction that he had with the Rebbe that night. But the way that as he says the story, he came in and the Rebbe asked him, the first question was, is he lonely? Does he ever get lonely trying to represent Israel in the family of nations in the United Nations? Now, I can imagine that being the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations is not an easy job. It can be very lonely probably when the whole world is out against you, especially then. And from that came a conversation, which is amazing, by the way, the side point, how the Rebbe was able to have such a sensitivity to the human element of what was going on, to the personal feelings of Yitzchak Rabin, how he personally was emotionally dealing with all the antagonism that he felt in the United Nations. And they then went on to a theological conversation for 20 minutes, Yitzchak Rabin says, regarding the verse, Am levadad yishkon, the verse we just discussed, the prophecy of Bilam, that the Jews will be a nation that dwells alone. And the Rebbe asked Prime Minister Yitzchak Rabin, in your opinion, the question I asked you, is this a blessing or a curse? And in short, the Rebbe's response was that it's a blessing. This is how God ensures that we will retain our specific, unique, divine, given identity. God gave us a mission. God gave us a purpose in the world, as we've been saying. We have to be a light unto the nation, that from little Israel, light will go out to the world. And therefore, God ensured that we would never lose our identity. We would never become assimilated and absorbed amongst the nations of the earth. And therefore, God created a nature in the world that the Jews would always be separated from the other nations. We would always stick out like a sore thumb. It could also be a curse because, as the Rebbe said, that this is the way that God ensures that we don't lose our identity. And so sometimes it happened many, many times in history. There are Jews that want to assimilate. There are Jews that want to be like everyone else. There are Jews that want to forget about our unique purpose and our unique divine mission in the world. They want to be just like the Joneses next door. They want to be like the other nations of the world. And when they try and assimilate and they try and blend in, God has no choice but to create anti-Semitism. As illogical as it sounds, it is illogical. It's a divinely created invention to ensure that we remain and we remember our identity. And by the way, this is the reality of the world. We see this clearly. You have Jews that may not be so Jewishly involved, and all of a sudden there's a terrorist attack, God forbid. There's a bombing, God forbid. There's a stabbing, God forbid. And immediately the Jews come running. They wake up and they're screaming and they're shouting and they're donating to Israel. Baruch Hashem. But the point is that we only wake up when we feel attacked, when we're reminded that we are different, when we're reminded we're not like everyone else. Anyway, this was the discussion that they had. The story was just the end of the story, the historical facts. In 1976, the Rebbe decided he needed to boost the Jewish community in Israel, the Chabad community. He sent 20 families from New York to go live in Israel. At that time, it was a very difficult thing to do. 20 families were sent, the shluchim of the Rebbe, to Israel in 76. And together with these 20 families, the Rebbe sent as his personal emissary on this trip to Israel, Rabbi Mentlik. Rabbi Mentlik was the Rosh Yeshiva. He was the head of the Chabad Yeshiva in 770. Very, very important person, obviously. And he was chosen personally by the Rebbe to be his personal representative of the Rebbe on this trip throughout the land of Israel to boost the morale, etc. And in the private meeting that Rabbi Mentlik had with the Rebbe before he traveled, the Rebbe gave many detailed instructions for this journey. The Rebbe gave him $10,000, which American dollars, and those are a lot of money. And he said he should give this to Yitzchak Rabin and to tell him that he is to use this as his discretion, however he wants to use it. He can do whatever he wants with it for the betterment of the land of Israel. But he wants to remind Rabin about the conversation that they had 4 years earlier about Am levadad yishkon, the Jewish people, a nation that dwells alone. We are a nation that will never be able to assimilate. We will always be unique and separated amongst the nations. And sure enough, Rabbi gave him the money and he gave him this message of the Rebbe. Unfortunately, in 1992, when Rabin was re-elected and he was in his victory speech, he proudly declared to the world that an era of peace was coming. And I quote him, and he said, "No longer will the Jewish people be in Am levadad yishkon. No longer will the Jewish people be a nation that dwells alone. But now we're going to become a nation of all the other nations. We're going to learn to make peace and live in harmony with our neighbors." Of course, with all due respect, he was a fool to think he could change the words of God. If God says we're going to be a nation that dwells alone, he said there won't be, but today history has proven, hindsight has proven that the Oslo Accords were a failure. They did not create a love between Jews and the Arabs. And we're still a nation that dwells alone because, as counterintuitive as it seems, this is God's mechanism of ensuring we remember who we are. And this brings us to the conclusion of our class and the conclusion of the course. We began today with a discussion about the fact that the land of Israel is a land that has no natural resources of irrigation, of rivers in Israel. It depends on rain. although it was pointed out to me correctly that Israel actually does have tremendous natural resources, they were only recently discovered. They were not things that we easily were able to see. And Jewish history required the Jews living in Israel to raise their eyes to the heavens and to wait for the rain. And when you look up to the skies and you want to see if it's cloudy or if it's sunny and if the rain's going to come, it reminds you that all of your sustenance, all of your blessings, all of your parnasa, everything you have, it's all Mehakadosh Baruch Hu. It's all from God above. And when we remember that, that is the secret of our survival. That's how we're able to survive in the world. As long as we think that we're going to do it, as long as we think it's our success, it's our work, it's our achievements, then God has to remind you, buddy, don't get too excited. Don't forget about God. But when we remember God, when we pray to God, when we look to the heavens for our blessings, that is what creates God's desire to bless us, to sustain us, and to give us everything we need. And so just like it is in the economic element of Israel's survival, in its agriculture, that we have to be dependent and we have to be reminded constantly that we are dependent on God's blessings for survival. Yes, we have to plant and we have to plow and we have to do everything we can. And God says He blesses us in the work of our hands. Uverecha Hashem. God will bless you in the work of your hands, but the real cause of the blessing is not the work of your hands. The real cause of the blessings we have in our agricultural success is from God, and the same thing is in our security in Israel. So too is with our longevity in the land of Israel, our ability to survive and to remain in Israel despite the efforts of the world is not because we have a smarter army. We do have a good army, and we need to have a good army. We need to make the vessels, but the real secret is remembering where it comes from God. And this is why, when the 6-Day War was about to begin, several days before the 6-Day War, the Rebbe began the first of the mitzvah campaigns, the mitzvah of tefillin. And the Rebbe made a strong push that all over Israel, all over the world, but especially the soldiers in Israel, should all go and put on tefillin and pray to God. He quoted a verse that says that the nations will see that the name of God is upon you and they will be afraid of you. And the Talmud tells us this is a reference to the tefillin on the head of the Jew. And when the armies of the other nations will see the tefillin of the Jews, they will become afraid. And from this became an unbelievable push that will lead to millions upon millions upon millions of Jews over the last 50 years putting on tefillin. In fact, in those first few days after the war, that first months after the war, it was estimated that 400,000 people put on tefillin. Every single soldier in every single army regiment and every army base put on tefillin. There's no atheists in the foxhole. Every single religious soldier was going to their neighbors, to their other soldiers, let's put on tefillin, let's pray to God before the war. All over Israel, in bus stops and trains, the Jews were stopping. Chabad Hasidim were stopping people in bus stops and in marketplaces. Let's put on tefillin. After the war was over, we all know the miracles that happened. The miracles, unbelievable miracles of the 6-Day War. Afterwards, the Jews were allowed to go to the Western Wall. And as we said on Shavuos, which was I think 3 or 4 days after the war, 200,000 Jews went to the Western Wall. And right after that, the Rebbe said they should erect a permanent booth, a tefillin stand, to help the Jews come into the wall to put on tefillin. And from then, 50 years ago until today, any single weekday that you were allowed to put on tefillin, there are Chabad rabbis standing by the Western Wall with a table. There's a booth there. When we go to Israel, God willing, on our JLI trip, you'll come, you'll see the booth. Actually, a very close friend, Shmuley Weiss, who was an older yeshiva student here in Coral Springs, Florida, who was a mentor to me in some ways. We used to do the Sukkah Mobile together. I was a young little kid of 11 and 12. And he was like the older 22-year-old. I don't know how old he was. You know, he's there, Shmuley Weiss, lives there, and he's a permanent job. It's estimated that several million Jews have put on tefillin in the course of the last 50 years at this Western Wall. It's an amazing thing. But what's the point? Why was it so important for Jews to put on tefillin before the war began? Because, yes, it's true, we needed to have a good Air Force, and we had an amazing Air Force. The best Air Force is the Israeli Air Force. And we needed to have a good intelligence, and we needed to have good soldiers, and we had all that. But the secret to the survival of our nation, the secret to the 6-Day War, was that the Jewish people were connected to God. We remembered, we looked up to the heavens and said, "May Ayin Yahweh ask me, from where will my help come? May Hashem Shemayim V'Aretz, from God and may the heavens and the earth." We remember that our blessings don't come from us. We remember that our security doesn't come from us. Our very identity, our very purpose in the world is because God gave us a mission. God needed us to be that little light in the very center of the universe from which the world would be full of knowledge of God. And by putting on tefillin, by praying to God, by connecting to our spiritual source, that is directly what caused all the miracles, the connection to God. And this applies till today. Very often we sit here in America, we sit here in Florida, and we say, what could I do for Israel? We hear what's going on, we know about the threats, we know about the problems, but we're not soldiers, we're not warriors, maybe we're not rich and we can't send lots of money to support the Israeli settlements, etc., the kibbutz, and what can I do? And the answer is, go to shul and put on tefillin. Go light candles, go pray, give a little charity. Every mitzvah you do creates a spiritual energy for the people of Israel. Because when you're connected above, as I always say, my favorite line, when you're connected above, you don't fall below. When we're connected above, when we put on tefillin, when we're connected to God, and we remember who we are, we remember why we are, we remember why we are where we are, then God promises us not just the survival of a nation, but the thriving of a nation, the success of a nation, to be God's nation, to be God's chosen people, to be the ones to transform the entire world into a home for God, until very soon, as the prophets say about Yerushalayim, that Yerushalayim will become the center of the universe from which the entire world will be filled with the knowledge of God, like the ocean fills, the water of the ocean fills the seabed. May that day of ultimate divine revelation, of ultimate human world peace, of ultimate harmony and love in every single human being come very, very soon. The coming of Mashiach, God willing, speedily in our day.